In the decades after World War II, construction sites across Europe began to change in a way that most people didn't immediately notice. Machines had always been present on large projects. Steam shovels, cable cranes, and excavators had existed since the late 1800s. But these machines still required human strength, human judgment, and human endurance to operate effectively. Then something shifted. By the 1960s, a new category of machine appeared that didn't just assist human labor. It replaced the need for it entirely. This wasn't about making workers stronger. It was about making their strength irrelevant. The hydraulic excavator didn't just change how construction work was done. It changed who had power on the job site, what skills mattered, and what labor was worth. This is the story of how human strength became obsolete on construction sites. Not gradually, not partially, completely. Before hydraulic excavators became standard, construction work was defined by physical force applied over time. Digging a foundation meant crews of men with shovels working in shifts. Moving earth meant wheelbarrows, carts, and human backs. Even when machines were introduced, they didn't eliminate this reality. They just concentrated it. Cable-operated excavators had been in use since the early 1900s. These machines used steel cables running through pulleys to control a bucket or shovel. The operator pulled levers that tightened or loosened cables, which in turn moved the digging arm. But cable excavators had a fundamental limitation. The operator didn't control the bucket directly. They controlled tension in cables. This meant every movement required constant adjustment, constant compensation for slack, constant anticipation of how the cables would respond under load. It took years of experience to operate a cable excavator well. An experienced operator could feel the tension in the cables, anticipate how the bucket would respond, and adjust in real time. But even the best operators were limited by the physics of cable systems. Cables stretch under load, they wear unevenly, they require regular replacement. Most importantly, they can't push, they can only pull. This meant cable excavators were excellent at certain tasks, like pulling a bucket toward the machine, but poor at others, like pushing material away or holding a bucket steady in midair. But more fundamentally, cable excavators still required significant human strength and endurance to operate. The levers controlling the cables weren't power-assisted. An operator spent the entire day pulling heavy levers, fighting against the resistance of steel cables under tension. By the end of the shift, operators were physically exhausted. This wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a structural limitation. An exhausted operator makes mistakes, precision deteriorates, speed decreases. The machine's theoretical capability was limited by the human operating it. Construction companies understood this. That's why they employed not just machine operators, but entire crews to support excavation work. A typical excavation operation in the 1940s and early 1950s would include the machine operator, a ground crew guiding the bucket and clearing obstacles, laborers moving material the machine couldn't reach, and support workers maintaining cables and performing constant adjustments. This wasn't mechanization replacing labor. This was mechanization requiring labor. And that meant power on the job site remained distributed. The machine was a tool, but it was a tool that still depended on human strength, human coordination, and human endurance. Then hydraulic power changed the equation entirely. Hydraulic power wasn't a new concept. The basic principle, using pressurized fluid to transmit force, had been understood since the 18th century. Industrial hydraulic systems existed in factories and workshops throughout the early 1900s. But applying hydraulics to mobile construction equipment was a different challenge. Early hydraulic systems were heavy, prone to leaks, and required significant maintenance. In the harsh environment of a construction site, dirt, debris, temperature extremes, early hydraulic systems failed regularly. This is why cable systems dominated for so long. They were mechanically simple. A broken cable could be replaced. A worn pulley could be swapped out. The technology was proven, understood, and repairable by any competent mechanic. Hydraulics seemed fragile by comparison. But in post-war Europe, several factors converged that made hydraulic excavators not just viable, but inevitable. First, the demand for construction was unprecedented. Cities needed to be rebuilt, infrastructure had been destroyed. There was more work than there were workers to do it. Second, hydraulic technology had improved dramatically during the war. Military equipment, aircraft landing gear, gun turrets, submarine controls, had driven rapid development in hydraulic seals, pumps, and fluid systems. By the late 1940s, hydraulic components were far more reliable than they had been a decade earlier. Third, and most importantly, labor costs were rising. In the immediate post-war period, European economies faced labor shortages. Construction companies couldn't find enough workers, and the workers they could find demanded higher wages. This created pressure to find alternatives. French manufacturers were among the first to pursue hydraulic excavators seriously. Poquelin, a French company founded in 1927, had been manufacturing cable excavators before the war. In the early 1950s, they began experimenting with hydraulic systems. Their early models weren't revolutionary in appearance. They looked similar to cable excavators, but the cables had been replaced with hydraulic cylinders. Instead of steel ropes running through pulleys, pressurized oil and sealed cylinders extended and retracted rams that moved the arm. The force came from the hydraulic pump, not from the operator's muscles. This meant several things happened simultaneously. First, operator fatigue disappeared as a limiting factor. Operating a hydraulic excavator required no more physical effort than steering a car. An operator could work a full shift without physical exhaustion affecting performance. Second, precision increased dramatically. Because hydraulic cylinders could hold position under load without the operator applying constant force, the bucket could be positioned and held exactly where needed. Third, and most significant, the machine no longer needed a support crew. With a cable excavator, ground crews were necessary because the operator had limited visibility and limited precision. With a hydraulic excavator, the operator had direct control. The bucket went exactly where the operator directed. It could be held steady, moved slowly, or repositioned quickly without requiring anyone on the ground. A single operator could now do work that previously required a machine operator plus a crew. This was the shift that mattered. Not that the machine was stronger, not that it was faster, but that it no longer needed people the way it used to. German manufacturers recognized the implications quickly. Demag and Owenstein and Koppel, both established manufacturers of construction equipment, began developing hydraulic excavators in the mid-1950s. They understood that hydraulic systems weren't just an incremental improvement, they were a fundamental restructuring of how excavation work could be organized. By the late 1950s, hydraulic excavators were being adopted across Europe. Not universally and not without resistance, but steadily. Construction companies that adopted hydraulics early discovered they could bid lower on projects because their labor costs were lower. A job that previously required an excavator, an operator, and a 4-person ground crew could now be done with an excavator and a single operator. This created competitive pressure. Companies still using cable excavators found themselves unable to match the pricing of competitors using hydraulics. They had two choices: adopt the new technology or lose contracts. Most chose to adopt. Once a company owned hydraulic excavators, going back to cable systems wasn't just inefficient, it was impossible. But this created a secondary effect that's often overlooked. When a construction company switched from cable excavators to hydraulic excavators, they didn't just reduce crew sizes, they eliminated the need for workers with specific skills that had taken years to develop. Operating a cable excavator required experience. A new operator needed months or even years to develop the feel for cable tension, to learn how to anticipate the machine's behavior, to understand how different soil conditions affected cable stretch and bucket control. Operating a hydraulic excavator required training, but not experience in the same way. The machine responded predictably. A competent operator could be trained in weeks, not years. This compression of required skill had a direct effect on labor markets and bargaining power. Experienced cable excavator operators had held significant leverage. They were difficult to replace. Their expertise was valuable because it took time to develop. Hydraulic excavator operators were more replaceable. The skill ceiling was lower. This meant their bargaining power was lower. Construction companies recognized this advantage immediately. Hydraulics didn't just reduce the number of workers needed, it reduced the company's dependence on any individual worker. This is the pattern that repeats throughout industrial history. The most significant technological shifts aren't the ones that make work easier. They're the ones that make workers less necessary. By the early 1960s, hydraulic excavators were becoming standard on European construction sites. But in the United States, adoption was slower. American construction companies had different economics. Labor was more abundant. Cable excavators were deeply entrenched in practices and union agreements. Caterpillar, the dominant American manufacturer, didn't introduce a hydraulic excavator until the early 1970s. But as labor costs rose and union negotiations became more contentious, American companies recognized what their European counterparts already knew. Hydraulic excavators reduced dependence on organized labor entirely. A company operating hydraulic excavators needed far fewer workers. This meant less exposure to labor disputes, simpler management, and more predictable costs. From a business perspective, this was far preferable. From a labor perspective, it was a permanent loss of leverage. By the mid-1970s, hydraulic excavators were standard across North America and Europe. Cable excavators were obsolete outside of a few specialized applications. The transition was complete. But what's important to understand is what was actually replaced. The common narrative is that machines replaced manual labor, or hard physical work. That's not quite accurate. What hydraulic excavators replaced was the need for human strength as a component of the production process. Before hydraulics, human physical capability was a necessary input. Even when machines were involved, human endurance, human strength, and human coordination were essential to getting work done. After hydraulics, those inputs became optional. A hydraulic excavator didn't need a strong operator. It didn't need an operator who could work a full shift pulling heavy levers. It needed someone who could operate controls. That's a very different requirement. This distinction matters because it reveals the actual mechanism of displacement. Workers weren't replaced because they were inefficient. They were replaced because the work no longer required what they provided. Human strength, which had been valuable because it was necessary, became worthless because it was no longer necessary. There's another dimension to this shift that's rarely discussed: the transfer of power from workers to equipment owners. Before hydraulics, construction companies were highly dependent on their skilled workers. An experienced crew could complete work that an inexperienced crew simply could not. This gave workers leverage. After hydraulics, construction companies were dependent on their equipment. A company that owned hydraulic excavators could hire workers with relatively minimal training and achieve consistent results. The capability resided in the machine, not in the worker. The power dynamic had inverted. In a cable excavator world, workers held structural power because their skills were difficult to replace. In a hydraulic excavator world, equipment owners held structural power because machines were difficult to compete with. This shift is visible in construction industry economics. In the 1950s and 1960s, labor costs were the dominant variable in construction bidding. By the 1970s and 1980s, equipment costs became the dominant variable. This wasn't just an accounting change. It was a restructuring of where power resided. By the mid-1980s, the transition was so complete that it became invisible. Construction sites operated with hydraulic excavators as the default. Cable systems were historical curiosities. Few people entering the construction industry had ever operated anything else. This invisibility is important. When a technological shift is ongoing, people can see what's being lost. There's resistance, negotiation, adaptation. But once a shift is complete, the previous state becomes unimaginable. The new state becomes just how things work. At that point, the shift becomes permanent. Workers in the 1980s didn't think of themselves as displaced by hydraulics. They thought of themselves as operating excavators. The fact that excavators used to require larger crews, more skill development, and different labor economics wasn't part of their experience. The shift had become naturalized. This is the final stage of technological displacement. Not just that workers are replaced, but that the memory of what they used to do fades. And this wasn't the last time this would happen. The pattern established by hydraulic excavators, capability moving from human workers into machines, skill requirements compressing, bargaining power shifting from labor to capital, has repeated across industries. Factory automation in the 1980s and 1990s followed the same logic. Computer-aided design replaced drafting departments. Automated logistics systems replaced warehouse workers. Each time, the story was the same. Not that machines did the work faster, but that they eliminated the need for human capability entirely. Today, construction sites operate on the logic that hydraulic excavators established. Work is organized around machines, not crews. Operators are hired for their ability to control the equipment, not for their physical strength. Companies invest in fleets, not in developing skilled labor over years. The hydraulic excavator didn't just make construction more efficient, it changed who mattered on a job site. Before hydraulics, workers with strength and experience held power because the work required them. After hydraulics, equipment owners held power because the work required machines. The hydraulic excavator made human strength obsolete on construction sites, not gradually, not partially, completely. And once that happened, there was no going back. The machine hadn't just replaced muscle power, it had eliminated the need for muscle power to matter at all.